Hi everyone, welcome to our Wednesday seminar series hosted by the Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. My name is Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani. I know many of our attendees look forward to Behruz Tabrizi's weekly appearance and his humor and wit. But this year he is on sabbatical. However, we are fortunate to have Dr. Julia Bichar, Associate Professor at Department of Anthropology, as our interim director this year. On behalf of the Mossavar-Rahmani Center, it is my pleasure to welcome Professor Alan James Fromherz. Dr. Fromherz is Professor of History and Director of the Middle East Studies Center at Georgia State University. Previously, he has authored the books Qatar, A Modern History, Ibn Khaldun, Life and Times, and the edited volume, The Gulf in World History, Arabia at the Global Crossroads. Today, we are fortunate to have him for this talk on his latest book, A Center of the World, A Global History of the Persian Gulf from the Stone Age to the Present. The book is on sale actually at Lambert Bookstore in case you want to pick it up on Nassau Street. And I had the chance to read it recently, and I must say the way it weaves the breadth of information it provides and the unique unheard stories before makes for fascinating. The Center of the World also presents us with a window into the cosmopolitanism of port cities lining a body of water that has resisted imperial control for millennia, depended on constant exchange with the world for its survival, but whose existence and viability as a center for trade and global encounters has been threatened by rising territorial claims and centralizing policies of its surrounding Asian states. So without much further ado, I welcome Professor Fromherz.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the Mossavar-Rahmani Center. I want to thank Shargim and Behruz and everyone, and Femke and Allison, of course. Thank you so much for being so hospitable. I feel like I am a Shah here, being welcomed to the Princeton campus in your hospitality. Thank you. So I actually wanted to start with a quote from the book. And some of you might be familiar with the Maqamat of Al-Hariri. And this is one of the last of the Maqamats. This is a passage, a poem that Abu Zayd, who's a trickster, right? He's a traveler always moving around like the merchants and travelers of the Khalij, of the Gulf. And he changed his personality according to what suited him and changed his identity as well, right? That's one of the characteristics of travel that you get to do, pre-Facebook at least. You could become somebody different when you go someplace else, right? So this Abu Zayd, he's a consummate trickster, and he's a bit of a liar too about things. But like many tricksters, sometimes the trickster and the one who tells superficial lies actually tells the most profound truths at the same time. And one of these profound truths was given by Abu Zayd at the end of the Maqamat when he says, "Weep not for a friend that is distant, nor for an abode, but turn thyself about with fortune as it turns about. Reckon thou all humankind thy dwelling place, and fancy all the earth thy home." So this is in the 11th century, this idea of a universal global humanity, right? Where does this idea come from, and how is it manifested repeatedly over and over in the literary traditions of the Persian Gulf? That is one of the questions that really compelled me to write this book. So let's go to the main arguments of the book. And first, I want to give credit to my Mediterranean background, and any of you who have studied Renan Braudel, the great analyst historian. He has this wonderful idea about history that I call the three-layer cake approach to history. So you have on the bottom layer of the cake, long-term history, things that are determined by geographical forces, right? The fact that we have the Atlantic Ocean next to us in New Jersey determines a lot of the history of New Jersey, right? The fact that you have the massive mountains of the Zagros, and many of the mountains, for example, if you go to the Musandam Peninsula and look across to Iran, you see they're like the fjords of Norway, right? They're not the most hospitable or easiest for large, extensive urban establishments or for the establishment of empire. And one of the main arguments I make in the book is that the extremes of the mountains, the marshes, and the deserts that encapsulate and hug the Persian Gulf all the way around this body of water act like a natural fortification to prevent the Gulf from being dominated by any single imperial power in a completely convincing way, right? And that allows for the Gulf to be very close to imperial powers and even take advantage of trade between imperial powers, but remain autonomous from those powers. So a lot of historians recently, it's very trendy, the history of empire. I don't know if you've heard of Cooper and Burbank and their history of empire, have assumed that the idea of cosmopolitanism necessitates an empire, right? You need to have a cosmopolis, which is the imperial center. And once you have the imperial center, then you can have a cosmopolitan ethic. What I found in the history of the Persian Gulf, that it's actually in the Gulf, outside of imperial control, that you have the most vibrant mixing and cosmopolitanism going on, okay? So this geographical condition of the Gulf, in some ways it's limiting, right? Because you have to import water oftentimes. You have to even import food. But it really concentrates people's efforts and their economy on trade and on exchange. And this is millennia before globalization pushed everyone in that direction today, okay? One of the interesting facts of world history that we don't often realize is that agriculture, just sitting there, digging up potatoes and things and growing wheat, dominated the world economy up to 90% of the world economy up until 1800. So everything up to 1800, almost everything was focused on agriculture, right? And that's where these large agricultural empires developed and where you had hierarchies developing around those agricultural empires. So serfdom, hierarchies of class and privilege, you only had a very small percentage of the economy that was based in trade between different polities or between different places, and maybe luxury goods and other forms of home crafts and manufacture. What happened in the Gulf, which is very interesting, is that they didn't have much agriculture, but they were already engaged in a type of long-distance global trade long before it became the big thing that it is today, right? In fact, the first global trade was happening out of the Gulf. And this is because of its natural maritime connections. If you look at the place of the Gulf on a map of Eurasia, it's sort of this hypotenuse. It's this way to skip from the Eastern Mediterranean to the doorstep of India, right? It's the fastest non-air way. I remember going and visiting the Euphrates River in Syria before all of the horrible situation erupted. And you just get on a raft, literally, and you're floating down, and you end up in Basra. It's really quite magical how that happens. And then from Basra to Hormuz, and then you're nearly to, of course, Pakistan and then India. So there's the geographical realities that I think create a long-term pattern over Gulf history. And then there's cultural realities. This is the medium-term history, the middle of the cake, that maybe change a little bit more than geography, but also take a bit longer in time to change. So cultural changes over centuries, geographical changes over millennia or even hundreds of thousands of years. And I think one of the aspects of the culture of the Gulf that emerges is this idea of a compromise almost, or a combination of being both distinctive and cosmopolitan. How does that work? Right? How can you be both tied to your identity very strongly, but also understand a cosmopolitan ethic? For many philosophers today, it's considered impossible. Right? In fact, there's a great and very vibrant debate happening between philosophers like Kwame Appiah and Francis Fukuyama, trying to determine, are humans fundamentally tribal in nature? Do we fundamentally think of ourselves in terms of our identities? Or do we think of ourselves as part of a larger human humanity, a larger universal concept, right? So you even think of this in terms of structuralism versus constructivism, right? Are we according to the structures that we're born with as humans, or are we according to what culture creates in us? It's a grand academic debate. But I think in many ways it's a mirage of what actually happens when people are living in their lives in places like the Gulf, where you are constantly encountering others, and where the culture has been encountering others, not just over the past 100 years or 150 years, but over the past 5 millennia. The Gulf is this nexus of cosmopolitan encounters between people with distinctive identities. And what the Gulf shows is that you can maintain your culture and still go out on a ship with 60 people of completely different faiths and backgrounds and come back to that identity once more, which I think is really fascinating. And this trope and this story of going out into the Indian Ocean in particular, which really was the world. Most of the human population over world history was settled or included or interacted with the Indian Ocean. We think of world history in terms of the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean is very small compared to the Indian Ocean, as many of you know, okay? And then we have the top layer of the cake, of Brodel's cake of history. Apologies to anybody who actually is an analyst here if I am using a cake, but I think it's fine. The histoire événementale, or the history of events. This is the political events, you know, sort of the daily churn of time. And what we find with Gulf politics and Gulf polities, the actual individual rulers of these different centers of exchange that rise up in different parts of the Gulf, is that they are merchant princes, most often, merchant princes. They don't see themselves as above the merchants, as you find in sort of feudal agricultural states. They see themselves as equivalent to the merchants, and they see themselves, in fact, as encouraging merchants to come to their city, right? And highly dependent on trade and customs duties in particular, right? So the whole revenue of many of these Gulf polities came from customs, came from charging for the trade that's coming in and out of their port. Once that dries up, once the merchants decide to go to a different port, then the prince is out of luck, right? And oftentimes, these merchant princes wouldn't even stay in the place that they were supposed to be from. They would go for 6 months on the monsoon and go to India and trade in pearls or other items. And then they would come back to their home. Oftentimes they would let women be in charge, or African slaves, for example, who were left in charge as faithful servants of their city. Why do you think, and I ask my students this, why would you leave your city in charge of somebody who's from outside of your tribe or outside of your family? What we forget is that usually it's a member of your own family who wants to overthrow you, right? So you don't really want to give it over to Brother Khalid because he might be like in charge the next time you come back. Okay, so that's sort of the political layer of history. And you can see, of course, on the map, the mountains, most famously, of course, the Zagros Mountain, the Great Marshes, the desert, and all of these are geographical realities in the extreme, right? So the type of adaptations you have to engage in order to survive in this Arabian desert, in the Reba Khali, are not simply the ones that you might need to survive in the American West, for example. These are the most extreme examples of many of these geographies as well. So you have people who become specialized in adapting themselves to these environments, and those are the ones who end up controlling the trade within the Gulf, okay? So my book is organized around particular places in the Gulf that I think embody or that most embody the cosmopolitan exchange that's going on in that particular time. So I open with the case of Dilmun, right, and the Dilmun civilization. Dilmun, if you've not heard of it, was an ancient 2800 BC, so 4,000, 5,000-year-old civilization based in trade between Sumer and Babylon and the Indus Valley. Okay, so it's our example, our first example, and even using these little seals here to identify which merchants' produce was going on its way to the Indus Valley civilization. Its main hub was probably on the island of Bahrain, right? And if any of you have been to Bahrain, they have this incredible archaeological richness on the island, and including the temple to Barbar and the temple to the underground waters. Why are these underground waters so important? Well, Bahrain is one of the few places along the Gulf where you are guaranteed to have this fresh water coming out of the ground in bounteous proportions, right? In fact, one of the most amazing things about going to Bahrain, if you look just off of the coast, you'll see that they have, it's very clear water. And you look down onto the seabed, and there's little stones around what look like vents coming out. This is fresh water that emerges into the sea and then bubbles up to the top, right? These are the underground waters of immortality that, of course, Gilgamesh, the great story of Gilgamesh, talks about trying to find these underground waters of immortality. But Dilmun is our first sort of ancient example of world trade coming out of the Gulf. And what you see in Dilmun and then the subsequent ancient centers of trade is that they maintained autonomy from the great ancient empires that were coming to the fore at the time. And I'll give you an example of that in a little bit. But first, I wanted to show you this incredible tomb. This is from Al Ain in the United Arab Emirates, or Al Barami, this oasis, which was actually linked to the Gulf. It was a way to go around the mountains if you came from what is now Abu Dhabi down to Sohar. But these incredible tombs from 2000 BCE, they show what archaeologists think is a type of egalitarian ethos among these smaller bands of people who were buried in these communal tombs. So everyone is buried on the same level. You don't have what later happened, which is kingly tombs, where you had one tomb for one particular person. And that's one of the interesting dynamics occurring here in the Gulf between these egalitarian communities and then their encounter with the merchants and with empires on the shore. Okay? But these ports really are very adept at maintaining their autonomy. And they make deals with the emperors, right? They make deals with the empires. They say, sure, okay, you can destroy us. You can take over our port. You can impose your imperial taxes, O Antiochus III, the Seleucid. But if you do, you will destroy all the wealth that is coming out of this great port city, this wealth and this perpetual peace and freedom which has been given to us by the gods, right? So in this message, for example, the king of Gera, which is near what is now eastern Saudi Arabia, right, Qatif, he's telling Antiochus, we'll pay you off to go away, and you'll actually be happier because you won't be left with just a devastation that's not going to get you any taxes anyways. Later on, the Romans, of course, based upon earlier reports and by the Greeks as well, they talk about a throng of cities and villages along the Persian Gulf coast as well. And even as we get to the rise of Islam, we have this really interesting intercultural mixing going on. And what I think is fascinating is you see the influence not only of Persian culture, but of course many other cultures coming through the Gulf, actually transforming Islam into a global religion and providing models of both power and sovereignty as well. You might think, oh, this is a typical Sassanid coin, right? This is a typical coin of a Persian ruler. It is not. It is actually a Muslim coin. After Qadisiyah, after 636, when the Persian Empire was destroyed and conquered by the Arabs still used the same image of the Shah, right? These images you can find even today in the Dubai Coin Museum. So we have the ancient example of Dilmun, and then we have the rise of a new great center in Basra. And Basra, right, I don't know if you've heard of very much about Basra, but many scholars think, and they've thought this for a long time, that Basra is really the cauldron of Islam. Right? We might know from a basic understanding of Islamic history that Islam began in Mecca and Medina, and that it's an Arab religion, right? It's the Quran, it's in Arabic, right? Come on, of course it is a particularly Arab faith. No, Islam and even Arabic itself was transformed in places like Basra and in the imperial capital of Baghdad by non-Arab, often Persian and Baluchi and Sindhi and African and even Zuti, people from Indonesia, people from Sri Lanka, all of these people who were, and from Central Asia, all the way to Talas, right, to the frontiers of China, who were streaming into Basra either as captives or as slaves or as clients of the Arab conquerors, right? And what's really interesting about Islamic law of inheritance is that even if you have a child with a non-Muslim, non-Arab, that child has the same rights, right? And becomes a Muslim in many respects, at the same level as someone who comes from an Arab wife. So what happened over just a few generations is you have people integrating into this Arab Islamic community and bringing their own culture with them, right? And looking at Islam and looking at Arabic from an outside perspective and trying to understand it. So the first books of grammar, of Arabic grammar that we have, that were written down, were written by Persians trying to understand Arabic, right? And we also have the rise of Sufism in Basra, right? Hassan of Basra, Rabia of Basra. Many of these, again, Mawali. These are converts or their ancestors were converts to Islam, but they are non-Arabs. There were still, of course, a lot of Arab families too, Arab elite families. And through this whole period, Basra maintained an incredible amount of rebelliousness and autonomy against Baghdad. You'll look at the map in your textbook and you think, oh, Basra is so close to Baghdad. Of course, it was part of the Abbasid Empire the whole time. Or it was part of the Umayyad Empire the whole time. In fact, it was constantly under rebellious kind of local leadership. The Mohammedads, you had the Ibadis even there that were revolting. You had the Zubayrids who were revolting. And constantly, Baghdad had to send down troops and governors to quell the rebellions happening in Basra. And it wasn't just political rebellion happening, it was also cultural and intellectual and literary rebellion happening too, and religious rebellion as well. That's what this Sufism was a challenge to a more literal interpretation of the Quran, okay? And it's in that context that this figure of Abu Zayd emerges, and also artistic expressions that show the link between Basra and truly long-distance trade, all the way to China, right? And we have in Guangzhou, which is Canton, a whole community of Arabs living at the time in the 10th century, connected here to Basra and Saraf. And we have the Arabs in Basra, the ceramic makers actually emulating Chinese pottery, right? So. And we have people thinking of all humanity and animals too, right? Just like J.D. Vance is thinking about animals. Okay, and this community that emerged in Basra in the 10th century, they were called the Ikhwan al-Safa, the Brotherhood of Purity. And they were these mercurial humanists, right? They were probably merchants as well. And one thing about being a merchant and someone who thinks a lot, especially in the Persian Gulf, is that the question of why are there so many other religions becomes a fact of daily life. And it's a question that they were not afraid to ask, right? At some point, you just get afraid to ask it. Once you become a certain religious adherent, you're like, I don't think I should ask the question of why, if I am a Christian believer and everything is supposed to be according to Jesus, why everybody isn't a Christian, you know? Because that's a little awkward. But these guys loved awkward questions, and they asked them all the time under the veil of secrecy, though, by calling themselves this brotherhood. We don't know the actual authors of these texts, but we have these mysterious epistles. You know, there's the most incredible epistle of all is a conversation or a trial between humanity and animals. But another epistle about the nature of the earth and geography is, I think, very interesting because it reflects a humanist vision that many thought was only apparent in European humanism. And that's this idea of the macroanthropos, right? The idea that all of creation, the universe itself, is a body, just like your individual body, right? what's fascinating is that cosmologists today, that they look at those fibers of super galaxies and everything, and I think I saw one with an image where it looked like a human body, so I think that's kind of cool. But the idea that all of creation, the elements of its matrices and begotten beings, has some sort of soul whose faculties are diffuse in all parts of its body, as faculties of the soul of a single man are diffuse in all parts of its body. So we want to recall in this epistle the form of the world and describe how this body is composed, this composition of the human body, not just of the Muslim body, not just of the Basran body, not just of the Persian body or the Arab body, but the human body put in comparison and connected with the universe. Right? And I think this is a really profound idea that's coming around here on the natural sciences. And one of the ways that they would kind of set up this encounter between humanity as a whole and something else was to compare humanity to the animal kingdom and to give animals voice as well. This story of the epistles of the Brethren of Purity, the case of animals versus man before the king of the jinn, Bawarsap, the wise, talks about a ship of about 70 sailors. And 70 is very important because in Islam it's believed there's around 70 different faiths, right? And God, of course, is going to choose the right one at the end. So you just have to hope that you're lucky or something. But you have 70 sailors, and they're all of different faiths. They become shipwrecked on an island, the island of Saun. And they have to find some way of living together, even though they're from all these different faiths. And they start trying to kill and butcher the animals because it's like, oh, well, there's animals here, we can eat them. Turns out on this island, the animals can speak and they have agency. And they call up the king of the jinn to adjudicate between humanity and the animals to determine whether humans really do have the right to take and kill and butcher and enslave animals. And there's some very touching, very profound arguments made by the animals on their behalf. In the end, though, the king of the jinn is convinced by a human representing all of humanity, a man called a Hanif. This is a concept in Islam of someone even before the rise of the Prophet Muhammad, someone who just naturally is connected to the idea of a universal God. A man who is learned, accomplished, worthy, king, pious, and insightful. Persian by breeding, Arabian by faith, a Hanif by confession, Iraqi in culture, Hebrew in lore. So he's Jewish too. Christian in manner, from Damascus in devotion, Greek in science, Indian in discernment, Sufi in intimations, regal in character, masterful in thought, and divine in awareness. He says to the king of the jinn, praise be God, Lord of all worlds, destiny of the faithful, and foe to none but the unjust. God bless the seal of the prophets, the Prophet Muhammad. And he says basically to the king of the jinn, at the end of time, it is humanity that is being judged, not animals. So that's why we get to go butcher animals and enslave them. So there we go. The Jewish community, which I just mentioned, I think is a really interesting thing to compare in the Gulf versus the Mediterranean. David Nirenberg, he's here at this Institute for his advanced study, and he's done some amazing work on the Jews in the medieval Mediterranean, in medieval Europe. One thing that I discovered in doing this research is just how puny the size of the Jewish community was in the Mediterranean, how small in number the Jews were in places even like Spain and Italy and the Balkans, compared to the Middle East, and compared in particular to these ports along the Persian Gulf and Basra. And we have to remember that even though there is the story of the Babylonian Jews going to Israel in the Bible, that there's also this great number of Babylonian Jews who stayed and who moved to Babylon as well, because it was such a rich and incredible place for trade going to the east. And in the 12th century, Rabbi Benjamin of Tudela, which is in Spain, traveled all the way to the Persian Gulf, and he was amazed by just how many Jews there were compared to what it was like where he was from, right? And far more than the mere hundreds in European places. There are 10,000 Jews here. Among them are scholars and very rich men. And 1,500 Jews live at the sepulcher of Ezra here, right? And this image taken by the famous traveler and adventurer Gertrude Bell, you may have heard of her, dressed up like an Arabian queen and went around. Near the sepulchre of Ezra, the priest who went forth from Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes and died there. It is a sepulchre and a large synagogue, but it is shared with the Muslims who go there to commemorate Al-Uzair. Right? So Ezra also in the Muslim tradition. Right? And hopefully, he doesn't specify, but hopefully it's not the same way that Abraham's tomb is shared, where they have the plexiglass in between the middle so that people don't shoot each other while they're. If anyone has been to Hebron, it's a very sad situation that's happened, because you have people who are commemorating Abraham, who is supposed to be uniting the different faiths, but you have to have bulletproof plexiglass literally through the center of his tomb to make sure people don't kill each other. Okay, so that's not the case here in Al-Uzair in Ezra. Also, there's, from Benjamin of Tudela, a Jewish official, he said, was controlling major ports like the pearl trade out of Qatif, right? The one that was in charge of the customs house. Okay? And it wasn't just the Jews, though, who were in charge of collecting taxes or collecting or charging usury, as was the case in the Mediterranean, which often led people to target the Jews. It was people from different faiths, such as Hindus, there were Mandeans, different types of Christians as well, who also took on that role. So from Basra, we then get to this chapter on Siraf. Siraf, I think, is a really fascinating example of a ghost town in Persian Gulf history, right? So Siraf, it's called Tahiri today. If you go there now, it's on the coast of Iran, you'll see almost nothing but some ruins and some tombs up in the hillside. But it once was one of the most wealthy, prosperous places in the world. It was really this Dubai of the 10th and the 11th century, right? And it had to import most of its water, most of its fresh water into the port. But it was so crucial because on the Persian side of the Gulf, you have deep water, right? And you don't have the same problems with negotiating all the silt and the sand. They actually shifted goods from larger ships to smaller ships so that they could go through the Shatt al-Arab up to Basra, right? And oftentimes they would do that at Siraf. And Siraf was really this bustling city that had wooden skyscrapers made out of the beams that were used to build ships. It had wealthy merchants and sailors everywhere. And suddenly, though, we see the decline of Siraf, the end of its prosperity, and the shifting of the center of commerce to various islands along the Gulf, like Kish and Keshem, and eventually moving southeast until you get to Hormuz. And in each of these cases, you have a place that was the middle of activity, the center of all things, and then it declines, and then it moves to the next place, and all the merchants go there, right? And it's this ability for the center to really move around the Gulf that I found to be really fascinating. This connection between the Gulf and the 70 faiths that I mentioned earlier is, I think, really fascinating. We all perhaps have heard of the Shahnameh. Those of you who have studied Persian history and culture, it's the book of kings. It's the great tradition of the different kings, the Shahs of Persia. Well, there's one edition of the Shahnameh that I think is one of my favorite and is most fascinating, of Shah Tahmasp from 1530 to 35. And it opens with this preamble of the ships of different faiths. So every different faith has its own ship. And they all set forth from a port on the Persian Gulf and go out together. Of course, the ship of Ali is supposed to be the greatest, but they still have this communication with one another, which I think is fascinating. And it's interesting that each faith is given a ship, even though it's actually on ships that you had people from different faiths actually interacting. This is the preamble of this version of the Shahnameh. When the 70 ships were launched onto the Gulf and all the sails were raised, there was a single broad ship in the shape of a bride, embellished like the eye of a rooster. The Prophet Muhammad was in it with Ali. Okay. So we have basically this need to respond to the diversity around you, right? How do we show that we are the largest ship and the most important ship, but still acknowledge all these different ships, all these different faiths coming into and out of our ports? What's fascinating is this really highly developed detail cosmopolitanism, if you can call it that, or strategic cosmopolitanism, in the way that foreigners were welcomed into Saraf. So it was almost institutionalized, that certain Hindus in India, there's a caste that will not eat the same plate or the same table as those of other faiths. So what do we do when we have our big feasts, when we have merchants from all around the world? What do we do for these people who don't want to eat with us? Well, we don't go yell at them and tell them they're wrong. We make certain that they have a place to eat on their own. Right? This is Suleiman, the merchant, in the 10th century AD. Right? And sometimes I find it hard when my vegan friends tell me they won't want to eat. But already Suleiman, the merchant, is accommodating. Okay? And there's also stories, of course, people who went to Saraf, like this captain who would never get off of his boat because he was afraid of ever having sea legs and getting on the land. So he just stayed on the ship, and they would just have this community of ships all tied to each other outside of the port. Okay, next up is Hormuz, which I told you about earlier. Eventually, the center of trade moves southeast, right, as you get closer and closer to the mouth to the Strait of Hormuz, which shows, of course, the predominance and the importance of India in the world trade, especially as we get to the 15th and 16th centuries. By the 15th century, you have this kingdom of Hormuz. Of course, Marco Polo visits before then as well, and they are highly autonomous again. They are these merchant monarchs, merchant rulers, who provide tribute to the Seljuks at times and to Persian rulers as well. And eventually they become conquered by the Portuguese. Okay? The great story of Albuquerque conquering Hormuz. What's interesting is that you had this multi-ethnic, multi-religious army there trying to prevent the Portuguese conquest. Unfortunately, they failed because Portuguese ships and guns are, of course, extraordinary, and Albuquerque was just really lucky. He went in personally and basically stormed in and took Hormuz. But what I argue in my book is that although usually the story is told about the Portuguese conquest of Hormuz, in many ways it is the Hormuzi conquest of the Portuguese that happened, right? Because what soon became apparent as soon as the Portuguese became entrenched in Hormuz is that they needed to keep the trade going or they were going to lose all the revenue from the customs house, right? They even linked the payment of the priests and the organ and the choir boys, who each got a stipend, to the customs house, right? So there was the Portuguese Inquisition. It did come to Goa. There were attempts to raise mosques. There were attempts to force conversions, but all of these fizzled out and never came to anything. And you have these Portuguese travelers and priests and later Spanish who come to Hormuz and they're shocked. They're like, why is this place like this? It's because of the commercial necessity that the Portuguese in Hormuz themselves understood. That if they were to exclude and if they were to enforce the Inquisition, they would kill the commerce that was laying the golden egg in Hormuz. Okay? The Portuguese, though, are important. They left this really interesting fort architecture, right? And enormous cisterns, which are really great because there's not much fresh water around. But if you have an enormous cistern, then you can make it through the summer months when all the other merchants are gone. And we have in the description of visitors from outside of 4 holidays a week, right? So you had different religious holidays happening throughout the week. You had Moors, Gentiles, and Jews without distinction of place, mixed one of the other differently in the cemetery, right? Even in the place of the dead, which is really kind of haram or not allowed in a lot of instances in other places. There's a story that this Italian traveler says happened in the markets of Hormuz of a Christian who was dressed like an Indian who bought from a huntsman some birds to eat at home, but the huntsman, believing that he was in fact an Indian who wished to make the charitable offering of freeing the birds, as soon as he had taken the money, opened the cage and let them out. The Christian started to shout, "No, I want to eat them." And the huntsman was informed how he had been misled. He had not only lost the birds, but had to return the money to the Christian amid roars of laughter from the bystanders. So these kinds of interreligious, intercultural moments happened all the time in Hormuz. And then we have Muscat, which was eventually taken and became the heart of the Omani Empire and the British Raj. I only have 5 minutes left, so unfortunately I'll have to go through the rest of these pretty quickly. What's fascinating is that Muscat, when it was taken from the Portuguese, it was taken with the help of a Hindu. So you had the Muslim Ibadi and the Hindu actually working together to take Muscat, and that I think was one of the keys to the success of the Omani Empire. And then we get to the present and we get to images like this that we really maybe think of as now stereotypical of the Persian Gulf. This modern skyscrapers, everything is new. But what I found in researching my book is that there's a continuity between that global image and the past, that it didn't just simply spring out of nowhere. And that there is, in fact, a history of this sort of merchant princes, of cosmopolitanism, of particular groups being necessarily in charge, but also allowing for openness of others. Imagine if all of a sudden, here in the United States, it was decided that we could allow 800 million people into the country who are not citizens. And then they could just work here and live here. I think there would be a bit of an uproar, right? If you go to the Gulf today, 90%, up to 90% of the population is going to not be citizens, right? Just imagine that, just think about that. And we think of that as being something extraordinary, but what I found in my research is that that was actually ordinary. That type and that level of diversity happening not just over the past decades or past centuries, but over many millennia. And what's happening now is that these Gulf Emirates are even changing those long-term geographical realities as well, and turning the deserts green and seawater fit for drinking, as Queen Elizabeth says in 1979, just after the Iranian Revolution is happening. So what is the future of the Gulf? Oh, this is something that I found very difficult and took me a long time to really consider in my book. But as Sarah Game was saying, the problem today is that the nationalisms and the divisions of borders that never existed before and that are really relatively recent, even though the past few decades, are splitting up the Gulf and potentially taking away that magic that made it possible for the Gulf to be this place of openness and fluidity in the past. So one hopes that those peacemakers in the Gulf, I'm thinking of Oman, I'm thinking sometimes of Qatar and Kuwait, can somehow bring about a peaceful resolution and avoid a conflict that would end this 5,000 years of extraordinary history and bring us to a darker place than it has ever been before. But hopefully the Gulf can continue into its future, even after and if the United States withdraws its forces, which right now are in essence creating an artificial geographical reality that allows all of these autonomous polities to exist. So thank you so much.
All right, so thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I hope I'm not wrong, but my key takeaway of it is that this kind of specific kind of multiculturalism that exists right now in the Gulf existed for a long time. Also, I went to see Raf, and I was so interested when you said all those, I've seen all of those ruins. I wonder if you can speak a bit about your methodology, because I can see that you're working through history of so many different cities, and I'm sure you came across a lot of different things. What makes you decide to put this in the book and not another thing?
Oh, goodness.
sorry if that's not your question.
Thank you, Q. I was limited, and I think in some ways it's beneficial to be limited by my editors. They said, you can't go over 120,000 words. So I did have to make certain strategic choices. So I wanted to choose places that represented different parts of the Gulf, right? And I wanted to choose places that were maybe the most emblematic of that particular time as well. But I don't only focus on those places in the chapters as well. As you read through the chapters, you can see that the emphasis does shift to other parts of the Gulf. And the methodology is really a combination of the Brodelian method that I discussed at the beginning, but also looking at economic history, at world systems theory, sort of challenging world systems theory at the same time, because world systems theory has some limitations and also global history as well, Stephen Conrad and that historiographical tradition as well. So thank you for your question.
I guess my question was a little bit about the period when you're talking about Islam coming into the picture.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not an expert on this, but how much of the universalisms that you were drawing attention to were actually an attempt at proselytization or at bringing people into the fold because you have these multi-religious sites you have people interacting, and Islam wasn't just fought through the sword, it was also fought through convincing people to come. So how much of this was also potentially a strategy to the faith?
Oh, I think that's certainly a strategy as well. And there are different faiths trying out different strategies too. But I think, yes, the fact that Islam had the backing of the nearby empire in Baghdad was very helpful, of course. I think, though, that it was really this question that the Ikhwan and other humanists had that was genuine, which is, how do we live in the world of strangers, right? How do you live in a world of difference and understand that in the context of your faith? There are some clues even in the Quran that come up, but then there's other parts of the Quran that are a little more exclusive, right? There's the famous passage that people go on many paths, but they find the face of God, right? And other passages. But I think, yes, there's a certain aspect of universalism that could be seen as a type of, as useful for those wanting to convert others, but also I think as a genuine question that they had from their encounters. So, yeah.
If I may, I have a question as well. You were talking about the merchant prince during the pre-modern period and how they essentially participated in the commercial trade across the Indian Ocean and such. Now, where so much of the investment is concentrated within these state-funded corporations, and they're directing their investments to Western Europe, to North America, buying shares of companies, sport washing, buying sport teams and properties in North America, Western Europe especially. How does this impact or destabilize this commercial equality that you speak of during the pre-modern period, whereas now it's especially highly concentrated within the hands of a few who are associated with the state or have state positions to direct funds abroad rather than regional or locally?
Yes, very good question. What's happening internally is basically the rise of the royals, I might call it, or people who claim to be royal in a way that is different from what it meant to be a merchant prince in the past. So even getting the trappings of a more traditional royalty or monarchy like you would see in a non-Gulf, more European tradition. And I think that's part of what is happening here, is this, as the economy is starting to meld itself with Western and East Asian and other parts of the world, it's losing some aspects of that unique Gulf economy that existed before. And it's developing stratas that didn't really exist in the past. And there's a very famous, I think she should be famous, anthropologist Annie Montagny-Kozlowska, who studied Qatar in the 1950s and 60s and other parts of the Gulf. And what she found is that almost every tribal leader who she talked to, and almost every tribal group, had their own emir, right? They thought, oh, we have our emir too, and he's equal to the emir who calls himself the emir over here. You know, even though we weren't recognized by the British in the 1820s by the General Maritime Treaty, we consider ourselves equal to them, of course, right? What has changed is this new concept, which is really a foreign concept of an exclusive kind of royal family. And at the same time, though, it hasn't gone so far as to break those old obligations of consultation, of the majlis, right? Of going and speaking to people of different tribes and listening to their issues and their problems. If that were to stop, this sort of informal way of people to talk about their grievances or their issues within the structure of the ruling families of the UAE, Qatar, and elsewhere, I think you'd have a breakdown, at least within the national population. And it has occurred in the past. There have been some protests and so on, and some wrangling for more formal representation occurring. But really, we think, oh, democracy, we need to have formal institutions, and in many ways that is, of course, an important and good step forward. But in the Gulf, it can be complicated as well. Because once you formalize certain relations, then it's hard for people to kind of wiggle around those and to make sometimes these more informal connections happen. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this talk. It was fascinating. And as you were talking, if I understood you correctly as I was listening, the picture that came to my mind was of truly quasi-utopia, where all sorts of different, religions and cultures, everybody was kind of in a true melting pot back 4,000, 5,000 years ago. And here we are in the 21st century where the words of diversity, globalization, universalism, you just get hammered with them all the time. And really the underlying sentiments that are really beneath all those lofty words are separation, distrust, very dark feelings. Now, my question to you is, was it really that ideal back then, or is it just human nature that as soon as you put differences right side by side, certain things just kind of bubble up like yeast in good bread, and that it's just unavoidable?
yes, if I had been given by Sharagim another 45 minutes, I could have spoken about the dark side, right? Yes, because there are stories of conflict as well in this history, for sure. But I think conflict is one of the most intimate forms of encounter as well. And if you look over medium and long-term history, what you find is that cultures that are in entrenched conflict, in the case of the Gulf, we have the classic example of Arabs and Persians in conflict over many centuries and many millennia. Even in the Shahnameh, we have Zahak versus Rustam, right? That you see an intimacy of exchange between these enemies, right? Where they become almost like brothers because they know one another. You always need to know your enemy, right? They know one another through that process of conflict. So paradoxically, in some ways, conflict is almost this way of creating encounter as well, right? And creating the conditions for those moments outside of conflict when you have the more peaceful exchange being possible. And that's why we have in the Gulf this interesting kind of patchwork. You have Arabs living in Iran. There's a large Arabic-speaking community along the Persian Gulf shore. Many of them with last names that are the same as the emirs and rulers of the Arabian Princeton, the Emirates, right? So like the Tamim. And then you have Persians, of course, who've lived for a long time on the Arab shore. I don't know if you've heard of the Bastakiya neighborhood in Dubai. It's this neighborhood that is where the Persian merchants lived, and they were from Bastak, which is in now Iran. Unfortunately, it was recently changed to the Fahdi, that the name became Arab. But for decades and for centuries, it was known as the Bastakiya. So you had this you had this constant moving back and forth between different shores, and you had this sharing between Arab and Persian sheikhs, and you had the use of Persians and Persian merchants, even like in Qatar, the Darwish, they basically ran the government for. So you had, so you have conflict, but then you also have these opportunities for encounter that happen not in spite of that conflict, but oftentimes because of the knowledge, that sort of deeper, long-term cultural knowledge that can come from that conflict.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us.